follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 7, Part 3. As he walked through the kitchen door, Benedict's eyes fell onto the laptop, which, as far as he could tell, was exactly where he had left it. Its lid was down. Beth and Drew watched him as he raised the lid and began to initiate the software. The same password-encrypted screen greeted him as before, and he looked at them in confusion. "Did you have any visitors while I was out?" he asked. "Were you expecting anyone?" said Beth. Unable to contain herself any longer, she handed him the hard drive. Attempting nonchalance, she said, "You might like to look at this when you've a spare moment or two. Oh, and Carlton sends his best regards too." Benedict gave a hearty laugh and said, "You had me there for sure. Go on then, off the record, tell me all." "There's hardly anything to tell, really. As far as I understood, Carlton quickly bypassed the security screen and merely copied everything off the laptop onto that external hard drive. Nobody has seen a single file. I took the wrong moment to take a tea break, and now I'm accessory after the fact in a web of intrigue," said Drew. "In essence, you have John's computer in your hand, and nobody is any the wiser," said Beth. "Carlton politely requests that you return the hard drive when you've finished with it. He says that there's no rush, and either you can wipe it clean before you return it, or you can trust him to delete everything without looking. And you can trust him, I'm sure. He really isn't interested in looking, so you needn't worry." "That's a most unusual character trait in a computer hacker. Are you sure he doesn't fancy a career change?" said Benedict. They put aside the business of the day and settled into private family mode. They had planned to eat early in the evening so that Primrose could join in. The men retired to the lounge, and Beth began the final touches to the meal. The mincemeat had eventually transformed into a chili con carne, as even Primrose was happy to eat a robust chili dish. A rocket salad was draining in a colander in the sink, and some nachos awaited a quick course in a hot oven once the family arrived. Some overripe tomatoes, green peppers and lemon juice converged in the blender to make a quick salsa dip, and a tin of budget tinned chili mixed with a tub of cream cheese made a surprisingly tasty extra dip. One of the meringue bases had predictably crumbled, so both were consigned to a plastic bag and were mistreated with a wooden spoon before being sandwiched between layers of strawberries and whipped cream in sundae dishes. Jonty walked across the village holding Primrose's hand, having evidently enjoyed the privilege of being favourite uncle for the afternoon. Nathaniel and Emma followed soon after. As they walked up to the house, they could see that Matt had arrived too. When the family were gathered in the lounge, poor Primrose couldn't choose which male relative to bestow her affections on first, but drifted between hugs until it was time for the dinner bell to sound. It was her job to ring the bell, and no amount of doting uncles could diminish her pleasure in such a responsibility. At the meal table, she combined attention as best she could by sitting between her two uncles, with the promise that they would swap places with Grandad and Great Uncle Benji during dessert. The conversation around the meal table was a lively mixture of catching up on family news and pleasant banter over conflicting interests. The various merits of 2- and 4-wheeled vehicles were extensively covered, and then front-wheel and rear-wheel drive got similar coverage. As expected, the topic moved on to music, and Jonty's harmless prejudice was given full voice. Uncle Benji kindly reminded Jonty that he had begun his career with the Silk Mill Brass Band at the Blackpool Winter Gardens Brass Band competitions, so any attempt at snobbery was futile. Jonty gracefully acknowledged that this was so, and admitted that he'd enjoyed reliving his past by playing to a largely uninterested crowd in a field only yesterday. Emma and Nathaniel observed that it was well past Primrose's bedtime and stood up to leave. Benedict also got up from the table and volunteered to walk with them, saying he'd like to stretch his legs and they could enjoy a chat as they walked. So as to give them a little more time together, Beth suggested a small alteration to the plan and took Primrose upstairs. She gave Primrose a wash, brushed her hair, cleaned her teeth and dressed her in a spare pair of pyjamas kept at the house. They then rejoined the party downstairs, and she wrapped Primrose into a blanket and set her on Uncle Benji's lap with a warm drink of milk, which she drank as the adults chatted. Once her mug was emptied, Benedict picked her up in his great arms, and making sure that she was thoroughly tucked into the blanket in his chest, he walked towards Lilac Cottage and chatted quietly with Nathaniel about his business and the state of affairs at the dairy farm. Walking up to the cottage, they were met by Walter at the gate. Primrose had been asleep for most of the time that they had been walking and talking, so Benji carried her up the stairs and tucked her into a small bed. He came back downstairs and stayed chatting as Nathaniel kicked off his boots, waiting for Emma to finish settling Primrose into bed before he returned to Beth's house. Matt had volunteered to drive Jonty back to the city rather than taking him to the train station, and they only waited for the return of Uncle Benji to say goodbye before they left. Drew, Beth and Benji then sat comfortably in amicable silence for some time. Drew then suggested cracking open a bottle of his prized single malt whisky. It was a bottle of Longmorn from a 22-year-old cask. He'd become quite a connoisseur since he'd discovered a dedicated website that catered for his little passion. Benji had originally planned to drive back home that night, but the mention of a vintage single malt swiftly altered his thinking, and he accepted the offer of staying over until the morning, when he would make an early start. Beth kissed each of the gents on the top of the head and said good night, before quickly changing the bedding over and sprucing up the spare room after the guests from the night before. Drew had helped to clear most of the dishes whilst Benji was out walking Primrose home, and she gratefully sank into bed. The remaining dishes could wait until tomorrow. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.